It can be inferred from the passage that the purpose of the author in writing the passage is. Option A says, to portray the international political developments after the present round of the UNCED conference. Now, there are two problems with this option. First off, the present round of the UNCED conference, or the UNCED conference in general, that is a limited reference. We see UNCED mentioned or discussed in the first paragraph a few times, yes, but that said, it is only limited to the first paragraph. The primary aspect here is the interrelationship, or rather the order of priorities of the northern countries, their concern, and the southern countries, or the south. So the north and the south are the key aspect of the passage, the primary aspect of the passage. So the UNCD conference itself, it was just a stage where the difference between this particular relation, these particular nations, the northern nations and the southern nations, that has come to the forefront, that has come to light. So that should not be considered the primary purpose of the passage. The second aspect is that to portray the international political developments is a little too generalized. We have only the north and the south as our primary concern. We don't have overall international political developments. While it's not directly connected to the UNCED or to the north or the south, but we do have a statement which suggests that this is talking about a certain group of nations which come under a certain order. It might be the UNCED order, we don't know, because that is outside information. The passage doesn't give us that information, but we can see that suggestion here. Already in the June 1991 Beijing Declaration of the Group of 77, the point was made clearly and bluntly. In the Group of 77, it can be inferred, talking about a group of nations. So that said, international political developments seems a little too generalized. Hence, A is not a very appropriate answer. We can eliminate it, though it is close. If we don't find any better answer, we'll default back to A. Option B says to establish the dynamic of the relationship between the political blocs of the developed and developing nations. This is quite perfect because it talks about the relationship or the dynamic of the relationship between the political blocs. Now, blocs, spelled BLOCS, talks about a group of nations or nation states. Here we are talking about the north and the south, which is basically, we can see it here, northern countries' main concern and the south. So the northern countries and southern countries, these two blocks are being discussed. And in that, we are talking about the interrelationship between these two blocks. We see that their concerns are different. While the northern countries are concerned more about nature, about ecological preservation, the southern countries are more interested in, they talk about justice, but we see from the first paragraph and from the second paragraph that the southern nations are more concerned about development. And that is also evident because we see that the nations, these blocks that we are talking about, these are the north and the south, but this option says the developed and developing nations. In this, we find that it is developed and developing nations because we have this statement here. On the diplomatic level, this was hardly surprising for most of the third world. Now, why third world and why is this relevant? Because we are talking about the southern countries here and the north-south division also. The North has agreed, or it is willing to give the aid that it has promised in order to provide development, clean technologies, access to bioindustrial patents, etc. On the diplomatic level, it says here, this was hardly surprising. For most of the third world, trapped by the failure of the politics of catching up, fears that the world will eternally be split between the North's super economy and the South's wretched economies. So in North's super economy and the South's wretched economies, again, it is inferable that we are talking about the developed and the developing nations, which is the North and the South respectively. So we find that B is quite valid. We can qualify it. And we were right to eliminate A because B is much more directly related. it is much less limited, and it covers the entirety of the passage, because we can find references to UNCED, and other than that, international political developments being generalized, we can find reference to UNCED in the first paragraph only, while we can find the reference to the North and the South, or the northern nations and the southern nations. In other words, as we have seen, we can infer the developed and developing nations all across the passage. So B is a better choice. Option C tells us to highlight the changes that the current round of UNCED conference has brought about in the relations between the northern and southern nations. Now, this seems to be quite valid, because it talks about the current round of the UNCED conference. It talks about the relations between the northern and southern nations. This is much more direct than B, because B had an inferential step in developed and developing nations, connecting them with the north and the south. But to highlight the changes that the current round of the UNCED has brought about, that is a bit of a distortion, because we see that there's hardly any changes. Old promises keep on creeping back up. We see that reference from the first paragraph here. In fact, during the debates leading up to the UNCED, attentive spectators wondered if they had not seen it all before. Slogans which had animated the 1970s discussions on the new international economic order kept creeping back to the forefront. So the old promises, the old arguments, they keep on coming back to the forefront. They keep on resurfacing, and that is the whole point here. So this UNCD is not much different from the previous rounds. We can see some of that. We can see a reference to that from the first statement itself. The UNCD process unfolded against a background of 40 years of post-war history. And we see that, again, the promises made by the North towards development, towards providing aid, etc., these promises have been, there has been, so there is some evidence of this, that yes, there are some changes, slight changes, but that said, these are still promises from the past. We can see that here in the second paragraph. Consequently, the South reiterated the unfulfilled demands of the 1970s and opposed them to the North's ecological impositions. So there is reasonable doubt with this option. It is very close, but compared to B, it is just slightly though, but distorted. So by comparison, B is a better choice. C can be eliminated. Option D says to illustrate the difference between the opinions of the nations that prioritize ecological conservation and those that pursue development. Now, this we can see is much more limited as compared to B, because after all, we have seen how the primary reference is the North and the South, or the northern countries and the southern countries. But this does not talk about the northern countries and the southern countries. Rather, it talks about the nations that prioritize ecological conservation and those that pursue development. Now, this reference is correct according to the passage. The South does pursue, or it is opposed to the North's ecological impositions. The North is more concerned about nature. That is its main concern. It is also mentioned here, since the North expects environmentally good behavior concessions as diplomatic weapons. We can see it from the third paragraph that the South desires, or it looks for, it prioritizes development. There are many references here, but that said, we are talking about primarily in the passage, we are talking about the nations and not the concerns or the priorities. The priorities, as we can understand, ecological conservation, a priority of the North, and pursuit of development, a priority of the South. These are priorities of these two blocks, these two groups of nations. These are goals. They are not the primary aspect. The primary aspect is the nations themselves and the interrelation between them, or the interaction between them. So D is, again, in its own right, it's a decent enough answer, but it's not perfect because it is a little too specific, and we have a better choice in B. So D can be eliminated. The correct answer is option B.